I may not wait for you to turn to the rest of them. I might. We'll see. I purposely did not mark it in my Bible, so then it would take me a minute to turn there, and it would remind me to wait for you. But I only do that if it's going to be really easy, and I think I can turn 3-4 pages without getting myself way too lost in front of everybody. So we'll see. We'll see if I'm right about that. 1 Samuel chapter 24, starting in verse 1, it says, "And when it came to pass, when Saul was returned from following the Philistines, that it was told him, saying, Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel, and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. And he came to the sheepcotes by the way, where was a cave, and Saul went in to cover his feet, and David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. And the men of David said unto him, Behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, Behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. Then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privily, and it came to pass afterwards that David's heart smote him, because he had cut off Saul's skirt. And he said unto his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. So David stayed his servants with these words, and suffered them not to rise up against Saul. But Saul rose up out of the cave and went on his way. David also arose afterward and went out of the cave and cried after Saul, saying, My Lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed himself. And David said to Saul, Wherefore hearest thou men's words, saying, Behold, David seeketh thy hurt. Behold, this day thine eyes have seen how the Lord had delivered thee today into my hand in the cave, and some bade me kill thee. But mine eyes spared thee, and I said, I will not put forth mine hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. And we'll stop there and let's have a word of prayer. Lord, I want to thank you for this evening and the time that we can take middle of the week to be able to set aside to come and to hear from you. Lord, I pray that you will use this time that we have in your word tonight, Lord, and speak through me. I pray this in your name. Amen. You can go ahead and be seated. This evening, I want us to kind of getting back on our series of looking at You Have a Choice, and I want us to look at David's choice to submit. Can we just take a minute and look at how difficult this would be? David is a man who, if you pay any attention to him in the Bible, he's a man who we know can handle himself in a fight. He played the harp for Saul and those things to soothe Saul's angry spirit. But this is David we're talking about, who as a young teenager killed a lion and a bear with his hands that tried to take a sheep from his father's flock. He can handle himself pretty well. This is David who, again, as a teenager, faced and killed Goliath, the little boy that Goliath laughed at the day that Saul should have fought Goliath, but David did. And again, a boy who then, once defeating Goliath, goes and takes his sword and cuts his head off. I mean, David can handle himself. This is David who by this time had killed, according to the and we're going to look at this some later, but according to the songs people were singing about him, had killed his 10,000s. He's led men into battle and fought and defeated enemies. This was part of what Saul was mad about, and was that the people sang the praises of David more than they sang the praises of their king Saul, because David had killed more enemies. David can handle himself in a fight, and while David may, I don't know this, so I understand I'm taking a little bit of liberty here, but while David may be, an even keel kind of low-key type of guy who doesn't let much make him mad, some of the things that Saul did would have been awfully difficult to keep your cool about, even if you're the type of guy who doesn't get upset about things. You think about it, Saul, more than one time, tried to stick David to a wall. David is in his presence trying to help Saul. He's there trying to be a help to his king, and Saul gets angry and tries throwing a spear at David and nearly pins him to the wall multiple times. You may be a pretty laid-back person, but it's going to be hard for a man of war not to get upset about that. I tend to be a laid-back guy. It takes a lot to get under my skin, but I'm pretty sure if a guy tried to kill me multiple times, that would do it. That would get under my skin. That's what Saul's tried to do. Saul tried to, again, things that Saul did that would have got to almost anybody. Saul tried to use both David's best friend and his wife, who also happened to be Saul's daughter, to get to David to be able to kill him. That's fighting dirty. To try to turn your best friend and your wife against you to get to you, that's pretty messed up. But David didn't get mad. He didn't get angry. He didn't try to get even. He submitted, which again is amazing because he had opportunity. The passage that we read to start in 1 Samuel chapter 24 is one of those opportunities. That if David wanted to get even, if David wanted to have his chance at revenge on Saul, this was the perfect spot. Here David is hiding from Saul, and Saul comes to the very place that David is hiding, and some would say, in fact, some of David's men did say that this is God giving you a chance, and here it finally is. Saul's been chasing you, and God has delivered him to you. David had every opportunity to get even with Saul and to end his reign and to take the kingdom. But he didn't. He didn't. Instead, he chose to submit to the Lord's anointed. Again, the passage that we read, it talks about that he felt guilty for the fact that he even cut Saul's robe. He knew it was wrong for him even touching Saul. Though he could have made the choice to move things forward in his time, he instead waited patiently for God. And all that said, David chose to submit. And I have three things that I want us to see in that tonight. David's choice to submit. The first thing I want to see, David chose to submit though it wasn't what he wanted. Remember, by 1 Samuel 24, David was already anointed. David was already anointed to be king. It was back and let's go ahead and we'll look back real quick. 1 Samuel chapter 16. 1 Samuel 16, like I said, I already got there, so if you're not there, you're in trouble. I'm just going to read a little bit of this. But Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thine horn with oil, and go, and I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. And it goes on, and we know how it goes from there, that Samuel goes and Jesse marches his sons in one at a time from the eldest to the youngest, and it starts off that the eldest comes in, and Samuel's thinking, surely this is the one, and it's not. And they go down the line one after another until finally he says, don't you have any more sons? Well, I do have the one, the youngest. He's out with the sheep. It goes from the eldest all the way to David. It was back in chapter 16 that Samuel, by the leading of God, anointed David as the next king. Because Saul had, all the way back in chapter 16, rejected God. Just for context's sake, chapter 16, this is super deep, is before chapter 17. Right? Whew. Okay, but it's chapter 17 where you start seeing things like Saul throwing spears at David, and that means chapter 16 is before Saul started chasing him, and chapter 17 is where Goliath was. So this, when he was anointed, was before he came and fought in Saul's place against Goliath, and it was before the spears, and it was before Saul started chasing him. He was anointed king before David has to go into hiding. That's before this passage in chapter 24 that we started with tonight, when David has the opportunity to kill King Saul. When David was still just a boy tending his father's sheep, he was anointed to be the next king, and now this boy who was anointed to be king, and now as a man is having to run for his life from the current king. Just super oversimplified, that is not what David wanted. I am sure the day that Samuel anointed David, you're going to be the next king, he did not imagine this is going to be what happens in his life before he's king. This isn't what he wanted. David was ready to be king. He had already proved that. By this point, he's already proved himself personally. He's already showed that he can and will trust God and will rely on God against an insurmountable foe. I don't want to go back on this. A few weeks ago, we spent significant time on it. But David fighting Goliath showed that when David faced an enemy that David in his own strength couldn't possibly hope to win, he trusted God. He's already shown that. He's already proved himself personally to their nation. I said it again, I think it was 2 weeks ago, that Saul should have been the man to fight Goliath. Israel chose him because he was goodly looking and big. They chose him because they wanted someone who would fight for them. But Saul wouldn't. He sat in hiding. You know, I have to think that there must have been some rumors amongst the army. I have to think that there must have been some extremely disappointed people who remembered, we chose Saul because we wanted a king who could fight for us. And now looking at the fact that we need someone to fight for us, and he isn't doing what we chose him for. But David did. And he proved himself personally to the people that he would fight for them. David, by this point, has already proved that he would fight their enemies. Chapter 18, I'm going to turn over there real quick if you'd like to. Chapter 18, just 3 verses, 5, 6, and 7. David went out whithersoever Saul sent him and behaved himself wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people. Catch that. Saul set him over the men of war. He was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And it came to pass, as they came, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tabrets, with joy, and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played, and said, Saul hath slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. The song is sung, and these praises of David, because he proved that he could and would fight for them. He wasn't a man to make excuses. He wasn't a man to come up with reasons why he couldn't go and fight. And we know in his later on, while he is king, he did make excuse not to go fight and made an absolute mess of things with Bathsheba. But at this point, David had proved, hey, I'll fight our enemies. By this point, David had proved that he could lead. We saw that in chapter 18 when he's leading men for Saul. Hey, Saul obviously trusted that he could lead. The soldiers trusted that he could lead. The nation, what we saw in chapter 18, verse 5, the people trusted that he could lead. David already proved that he could lead. Saul hated David, tried to kill him, and yet he went wherever Saul sent him and won. He proved that he could lead. And while chapter 18, verse 5, I think is a good example of the fact that he can lead, I believe a better tell that he proved himself as a leader by chapter 24 is while on the run from Saul. The fact that he's running from Saul. Look at chapter 22, verse 1 and 2. This is going to be the one right in the middle. It's that one I can't find. David therefore departed thence and escaped to the cave of Adullam, and his brethren and all his father's house heard it, and they went down thither. Verse 2, and everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented, gathered themselves unto him, and he became a captain over them, and there were about 400 men. Okay, so this is a better tell that he proved himself as a leader. David's army is 400 men who were those that were in distress, in debt, and discontent. You hear that description, and that does not sound like a great group of people to lead. I mean, just being straightforward here, the distressed, in debt, and discontent, they're not going to be easy to please. They're not going to be great fighters. This group is not by nature going to be great followers. This group is not by nature the cream of the crop that every leader wants them to follow. Hold on, yet it was this group that David led and raised up his mighty men. It was from this group of 400 of distress, in debt, and discontent. The mighty men of David that are listed in the Bible, they came from this group of 400. That shows good leadership. It was also this group of distressed and in debt and discontent that survived years on the run from Saul and his army, all while fighting their own enemies. That takes good leadership skills. He proved himself as a leader, and yet, though he was already anointed and ready and proved himself, though this wasn't at all what he wanted, he chose to submit. David chose to submit, number 2, though it could cost his life. I mentioned this multiple times, the spear by Saul that happened right after chapter 18, the song about Saul killing his thousands and David killing his 10,000s. One of those times that Saul does that is right after that. David was only doing what Saul told him to do. Chapter 18, it makes it very clear that Saul was the one that sent him out. And it's not like David is singing the song. Like if David came walking into the castle, humming the tune of the song about Saul only killing his thousands and me killing my 10,000s, I could see Saul getting upset about that. It wasn't David singing the song. David was only doing what he was told. Chapter 18 makes it real specific that David was going where Saul led him, leading the men that Saul told him to lead, the men that Saul put under him. And yet, multiple times, Saul tries to kill him. David could have, as I said in the introduction, David could have taken things in his own hands early on. He could have decided, hey, Saul's trying to kill me, and I'm the next anointed anyways. I'm going to beat him to it. But he chose to submit, though it could have killed him. He chose to submit despite years of exile. That time where Saul is chasing David, you think about it, it could have cost David his life in multiple ways. They could have, in that time, died of starvation. If you remember, there were times that David thought they were going to. Went to the temple asking for bread. When you're on the run from your king, food isn't exactly going to be plenteous. There could have been death from being caught. David had his mighty men, and David had his 400 in debt and distress and discontent soldiers, but compared to the king's army, this is nothing. For instance, where we started in chapter 24, when Saul hears about where David is, he brought 3,000. 400 against 3,000 is not good numbers. I mean, had at any point the king and his army caught up with David and his men, it would have been over. And there were multiple times that they were close. You think about where we started with tonight in chapter 24. David is in that cave, and we often look at that and see the opportunity that David had to kill Saul. And again, his men even said, this is it. God gave you this. But that also means that David and his men were trapped in the cave with all of Saul's 3,000 3,000-man army standing outside. I mean, this could have ended very badly. I mean, this could have ended in David's death right there. There could have been death in that time from their enemies. Remember, this entire time that David is in exile and he is running from King Saul to not get killed by him, he's still leading 400 Israelites around in often hostile territory. We know of times that they had to fight their way through, if you will. So you have Saul's army breathing down your neck and an enemy standing in front of you. There are in that stretch so many times that they could have died from this in all sorts of different directions. And I'm sure there were times that David and his men as well, but I'm sure there are times that David thought, I could make this so much easier on me and so much easier on my men if I just killed Saul and end this. But he didn't. He chose to submit. David chose to submit. Number 3, though the king in place was wicked. Though he was wicked. I mean, think about this. That makes all of this so much harder. Submitting to authority is never easy. We never have an easy time with that because we like control. That's why we often struggle with the idea of giving God control, because to give God control, it means I can't be in control anymore, and I like to be in charge. And we struggle often, if we're even not looking at the application with God, in any sort of application, we struggle letting someone else lead, because someone else leading means I don't get to do it my way. That I don't get to lead, and I don't get to be in charge and in control. Submitting to authority over us is always hard, but it's harder when you know that authority is wrong. It's a lot harder when you know, hey, that authority is wrong. Remember, and David knew this, remember, Saul was picked for the wrong reasons. They weren't even supposed to have a king. They were to be God's people, and he was to be their king, but they didn't want that. So they weren't even supposed to have a king, and even if they were, he wasn't king because he was godly, and he wasn't king because the people thought he would lead them to follow God. He wasn't king because he had even great leadership qualities. He was king because he was nice to look at and big and strong and could fight for him. He was 100% picked for the wrong reasons. If that wasn't enough, he disobeyed God. The Bible tells us about in chapter 16, where Samuel is having a conversation with God already about how Saul has rejected God. And the Bible tells us about times that he tried to go to God himself rather than going through Samuel. This was all disobedience to God. This was Saul thinking that he couldn't wait for God's timing, and he couldn't wait for God's way to do things, so he was just going to come up with his own way. He disobeyed God. He was a wicked king. Saul was a wicked king in that he sought his personal agenda rather than God's. You think about it, he fought his enemy rather than God's enemy. The children of Israel, they had enemies. It's not as if you have the battle with Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17 and the Philistines just disappeared. No, it's not like that at all. It's not like Saul killed his thousands and David his 10,000s, and that destroyed every enemy that they had. And other than David, they were in a time of peace. No, they still had enemies. They still had people that needed to be destroyed, but Saul decided that his enemy, was more important. Even just looking at it, set aside the spiritual side of this for a second, even just looking at it from the political side of this, you think of all the time and the effort and the finances spent trying to chase David. You send an army and your king chasing someone for that long, and it costs your nation. there's going to be financial burden that would take a hit, as well as I'm going to look at this in just a minute also, but the Bible doesn't give us exactly how long that stretch was that Saul chased David. Most scholars say it was something like 4 years. If your king is gone for 4 years, essentially, so he can chase a man he doesn't like, other aspects of your nation are going to get neglected because the king is too busy thinking about David to focus on his kingdom. But then you also have the fact that they had real enemies, God's enemies, still out there. Rather than dealing with them, he spends his time chasing David. He chased his will rather than God's. Again, if the scholars are right, 4 years. So for 4 years, Saul was so focused on destroying David and seeking his will to remain king and his will for his line to remain royal that he forgot to seek God. He was a wicked king, and yet David chose to submit. Despite all of that we've looked at already, David chose to submit. So as I studied this and I'm preparing for tonight's message, I kept looking at this and David's choice here, and I kept thinking, it begs the question, why? Why? Why did he choose to submit despite all of that? Despite the fact that he was already anointed, God had already said that he was going to be the next king, despite the fact that Saul was wicked and it was obvious he had turned from God, shouldn't have ever been there in the first place. Why? And the answer is twofold. First is David was patient to wait on God. A mistake that Saul had already made, not being patient. David was patient to wait on God. That couldn't have been easy. It's never easy for us to wait on God's time. We struggle with the idea of patience, but especially in a case like this. That's an extreme case when you're talking, I'm having patience to wait on God's timing, despite the fact that the guy I'm waiting to move on is trying to run around and kill me. That's an extreme case here. That's hard. And yet David waited patiently on God. But the other side of that answer, and the part for this evening's message that kind of trying to focus in on, David recognized that despite all of that, God had placed Saul. Though he had been anointed to be the next king and was ready and had already proved himself, and although waiting meant danger to his life, and although Saul was a wicked king more interested in his will than God's, he still submitted because he knew Saul was still God's anointed. Chapter 24, where we started, in just those few verses, David says it 3 times. Saul was God's anointed. So whether he liked what Saul was doing or not, he recognized Saul was still placed there by God. Whether he was a good man or not, he was still placed by God. Whether he was a wicked leader or not, he was still placed by God. So the application this evening, I'm not necessarily going to focus on the leadership of our nation or our state, though it could be a super easy application, but just leadership in general. Anytime that there is leadership, there is a struggle of, I don't like this. Anytime there is leadership, there's always that, well, they're not leading how I want them to, or they're not doing what I want or how I would do it, or sometimes even they're not doing what I believe God wants, and maybe even, like David faced, what they're doing is dangerous. Recognize that leadership, whether you like it or not, is there by God. And as such, we need to submit to it. Let me, just for a super brief moment, in my notes, it's like this big of a section, so super brief moment. Take it political for a second. Personally, I don't like what our governor is doing, but I won't be the one calling him names, because like what he's doing or not, if I believe my God is still in control, then my God placed him there, whether I agree with him or not. You look there, see, I told you, real small for the political. Take it to the personal side for a moment here, because we all have different authorities in our lives. Parents, husband, boss, teachers, pastors, whatever else. I'm sure I'm missing about 100 things of different leaders or authorities that are in different people's lives. You may not always like the decisions made. And it may be that sometimes you think, hey, they are wrong in that decision, or maybe that they should do things differently. But if you believe that God is still on the throne, then he placed that authority in your life for a reason. It really is as simple as that. If you really believe that God is in control, then he was in control when that authority was placed in position, and he put them there. The Bible tells us that God does that he places authorities. We think it's us. God does. Which means it's not your job to fight them. It's our job to recognize and submit to the authority that God has placed in our lives. Let me tell you, just in closing, our series is You Have a Choice. That is a choice that will have to be made, because it won't come natural. It won't come natural. I guarantee it did not come natural for David, a man of war, when a spear is thrown at him, to say, it's okay, I'll leave. Sorry, a man who has songs sung about him about killing his 10,000s, his natural instinct when a spear flies at him is to grab it and throw it back. It's not going to come natural. It won't just happen. You have to decide you'll submit to the authority that God placed in your life, whether it's who you would have chosen or not, whether it's done the way you would have liked it or not. If you believe, I've said this already, I'll end with this. If you truly believe that God is still on the throne and still in control, then God has them there for a reason. And we just need to learn to submit to him. Let's pray. Lord, I pray that you will help us to grasp this. I know this is it's a challenging thing. We all have difficulty with that when there is authorities in our life that we disagree with, that we don't like the decisions that are being made, and those sorts of things happening. It is a hard concept to, I guess, resign to the idea that I just need to submit, Lord. But I think we can learn from David in the fact that if we believe, if we trust that you are still in control, then you put them there for a reason. And it's not my job to try to push my timeline, my way, but just to wait for you and trust your reason and your time. Pray this in your name. Amen.
All right, with your heads bowed and your eyes closed, I'll invite you to stand tonight.